have to tell you, I find it hard to take when people run in circles. It's a very, very mad world. Mad world.
All right. Welcome, everyone, back to another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast. And this one is, we're recording this on Sunday, July 28th. And this is going to be the first round of really launching and broadcasting the opportunity to join up with us in Living Resilience and the Poetry of Predicament, to be in an ongoing year-long program. Year-long. It's hard for me to even say it because it sounds like too much, but I want to reassure folks, if you're listening for the first time to this promotion of this particular offering, I'm very, very excited because I have had a lot of attention on making this as useful, as valuable, as powerful as possible, and also to be as as svelte as possible, as honed down to the most useful and potent elements that we can find to address what it is to be a human being in this particular time. And I am very, very happy to have Jack Adam Weber here with me, who you can see on the screen. And Jack is, of course, the author of Climate Cure, which I believe you put out in 2020.
Yep.
And the subtitle of Climate Cure is Heal Yourself to Heal the Planet. And I've been really looking for the right place to be able to have that, your book, Jack, be have a cornerstone position for whatever the offering is that I'm going to hook it up with. And this is the time. And so the program that we're going to be talking about today is, the larger overview title is Islands of Sanity in a Mad World. And some of you who watch the Poetry Predicament podcast, you've already seen the first in what will be a year's worth of individual podcast interviews and also panel discussions about particular topics of use in this, what I consider to be a remarkably different and more intensified time of predicament and collapse. And it's, in my observation, we even in this hyper privileged world of the USA where we're speaking from, it's starting to be inarguable that we are going to be facing many of those elements from either the climate side of the house, in which, you know, we're looking at natural disasters and so on, to the financial and economic and cultural and societal elements of collapse that are showing up more and more around the world, but especially, again, here in the hyper-privileged USA. And Jack, the reason why I'm so thrilled to have you here today, and as your book being a central part of this, especially the kickoff of this year, yours will be the first book in a series of books throughout the year that we're going to be including in the work of Islands of Sanity. Is your focus, since the day that I ever met you, it was obvious that your work is the inner work of being a human being in these times. You know, when we first met, you were grappling with your home being threatened and then destroyed by a volcanic eruption in Hawaii. And again, I just from that first meeting knew that you were deeply embedded in that orientation of what is the most powerful inner work that I can bring to this situation. In that case, it was extraordinary. You know, your whole where you live and what you had spent so much time and energy and love putting together in terms of that homestead and your life in Hawaii. Needless to say, you've continued to just grow that, cultivate that, curate that inner work. And I consider you one of the premier voices in this space now, you know, far ahead of the vast majority of the mental health community around the world. They're barely scratching into alternative ways of addressing these existential challenges. And so today, what I'd like to be talking with you about is a little bit about you, your book, the work that you embody and the work that you offer out into the world, how that could be a fit, as ideal a fit as it is, um, with this program. And then, you know, really at the center of it, we're going to keep looping back through how do we redefine what is mental health now and what is mental illness now in a society that is literally self-terminating. I don't know of a bolder example of a society that is mentally ill, that is terminating itself. So it's a volatile conversation. It's completely up for grabs. And ironically, there's no one in government and no one in the corporate realm. There's very few people are having any kind of conversation about what is it to be robustly mentally well or relationally well or physically or spiritually well in these times. So I know that's a lot, but I put it all out there in one shot. And Jack, I'm wondering if you could just very briefly introduce yourself and speak a little bit about where you are now and what it was like to bring Climate Cure into the world, and what had you do that? What has you be as engaged as you are? I had forgotten after my first reading quite a while ago, just reviewing that you actually at the time that you're writing this book, you had given up your Chinese medicine practice and become full on an activist in this space. So I'm just curious if you would catch us up on what are you engaged with now? How are you doing? And how did this expression that is Climate Cure, how did it come about for you?
Hmm. You said a lot there.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That was 800 questions in
It's
one.
okay. No, it was great. It's just I sink into to listening to you, and then when I have to speak, I sort of have to climb out of just receiving what you've said. So
Got it.
um I appreciate everything you've shared, Dean. And you know, when I lost everything in Hawaii, I was sort of in the middle of writing Climate Cure. And when I lost everything, I went into profound grief, and you know, there was a lot of survival stuff going on. And so I just, you know, the writing of the book fell by the wayside. And um, you know, little did I know, but that I suspected, being used to these sorts of things, when things fall apart, right, that something is germinating at the same time. So the whole experience and the grief process that I went through and the grief process that I sort of facilitated and organized for my community in Hawaii ended up informing Climate Cure in a big way. So when I actually came back to to writing it, to continuing writing it, there was a whole different depth and breadth that was shared just in terms of story and in terms of actually being in the midst of a natural disaster, which I mentioned in Climate Cure wasn't per se due to the climate crisis, but certainly has the effect of that, right? When you lose everything, you lose your community, you can't even go back to your land, and you're just houseless and communityless and ecosystemless, and in terms of what I had bonded with. So that's a little bit of it. And what brought me to write Climate Cure? Well, first of all, I have a pretty rich history in grief work, and that's the personal work I did in my 20s, which you and I have talked about, and that's actually the subject of my new book coming out one day. Anyway, so yeah, so my personal history of grief work and going through dark work, right, and going into the painful places and the failing side of life and the darkness, and emerging from that with so much more light, so much more beauty, and so much bigger of a heart and integration, that sort of set the tone for the rest of my adult life in my 20s. And so practicing medicine for a number of decades, when I first learned about the climate crisis, I was just sort of shattered, and I came across the writing of and the information from Guy McPherson, and then other people who were really speaking to the depth of the crisis, and I didn't realize it was that bad. And I went into this period of depression. This was when I was, it's probably like 15 years ago now, and that transformed me some in terms of the beautiful thing about holistic medicine is that it's holistic, right? It's our whole world. It includes everything, and it includes how we treat the world and how the world treats us. And I've never been one to really like to stay in boxes, and I like to weave things together, and I like to dedicate myself to things that are most potent, even if they seem silly in terms of the modern contemporary gauges of what's successful and what is smart, or what people are going to say about me. And so in a nutshell, that boiled down to dedicating myself to recognizing that the earth is really my primary patient, and being a lover of the natural world. It all fell into place, and being with that grief and that deep sadness was sort of natural for me, and it was comfortable enough, and I had the previous experience of going into the dark and going into grief to be able to give myself fully to grokking the climate situation. And I read as much as I could, and I learned as much as I could, and I began to have conversations that I'd never had before. And so I began to apply and to view the climate crisis in terms of the tenets of Chinese medicine. So if the earth, the ecosystem, right, is a patient now, like how do I treat this patient? What can I do? And because human beings are integrally related to the health of the planet and what's happening, if not primarily so, well, how does our own personal health interface with the health of the world at large, and the climate crisis in particular? And so being a lover of challenges, right, to integrate personal health, right, and so medicine traditionally has been in a silo of just treating human beings, right, and it hasn't, and when you treat environmental sanity and health, it's usually through the lens of ecology and conservation and geology even, and so they're separate fields. So how do we bring the human natural world, the human more than human natural world into one whole? right? How do we imagine and begin to speak to health and wellness and thriving and sustainability and regeneration as an integrated, newly sort of synthesized, human nature development and evolution.
Mhm.
And so that's what I began to undertake. And the beauty of Chinese medicine, which is, my primary medical practice, you know, provides the metaphors for this. And that's the incredibly beautiful thing through yin and yang itself and through the five elements. And Chinese medicine was actually founded um, on human beings' relationship with the natural world. So, as I mentioned in the book, I see no better um, paradigm, right, lens through which to understand the climate crisis and our own human crisis, our internal crisis, our collective crisis, our relational crisis, the poly crisis itself, than through a system of medicine that is based on balance and sustainability and both inner and outer. And Western medicine just doesn't provide that.
Yeah. If I could, I'd like to just share with you some of what got me so excited to have your book be at the cornerstone position here. And that is that how I've been answering the question of what got us into this polycrisis. How did we do this? Um, the answer that's kept coming ever since I started that inquiry, uh, basically when I was writing my own book, the Impossible Conversation, uh, I kept seeing that what got us here is that we've disconnected from all the primary sources of meaning and relationship in a human life, which could also be called our center. We've forfeited our individual and collective center, and that seemed to be uh, such a close fit with what you've just described out of your own orientation in Chinese medicine.
Mm-hmm.
That orientation to embodied center in both the patient in their life, and then also in whatever the curatives are, whatever the interventions are, is to return to center. So yeah, I just love that you've brought us that part from your lineage, from your years of practice. And Jack, I'm curious, could you tell us just a little bit about how has this evolved? You wrote the book at a particular time, you finished it, put it out there, and um, true to form in the world, we've seen nothing but more and more of the rather cynical elements at play since that time. I'm wondering if there's anything that you're seeing as time has gone on that has a different level of intensity, a different vividness in your view, or just more of a concern from your perspective.
Yeah. So, one thing about trauma, so climate cure is rooted in a lot of trauma work. And one tenet of trauma work that I've acknowledged is that unless we deal with trauma, both personally and collectively, and again, it's like the human nature relationship that they both affect one another. And so they both have to be worked on. So there's collective systemic trauma, um, and personal, right? The personal things that happen in our lives. And so if you don't deal with that, trauma repeats itself because there's a pattern of wounding and a pattern of thinking and reactivity and emotionality, which is not healed and integrated. And so that begets more trauma. So when you look at that on the collective level, right, it's like the poly crisis is happening, right? And so we have the major wars that have broken out. We have the pandemic that came. We have likely more pandemics that will come, more warring, more fascism in the world. And so this sort of extremism begins to become more and more prevalent. And that extremism, that black or whiteness, it is itself a dynamic of trauma, right? And the lack of integration, right? Yin and yang begin to separate. And so, one of the foundations that I tried to lay in Climate Cure is this foundation, right? The lens that I was referring to of yin and yang and the 5 elements and some of the dynamics of understanding the dynamics of the world, both outwardly and personally, through these metaphors. Because whether they're applied to the climate crisis or applied to political extremism, social unrest, racism, whatever it is that creates injustice and that creates more and more destruction and suffering can be viewed through this lens. So, it takes a bit of patience to sort of immerse oneself into grokking these metaphors, but understanding them then gives you the capacity to understand things in a global kind of a way. And the other dynamic that I've woven into Climate Cure is a lot of Western psychology and trauma science and neuroscience, and I spent years too, like sort of separately before I got into the climate crisis, weaving those dynamics from that personal work I did in my 20s into the framework of Chinese medicine. So Climate Cure really is multidimensional, and it takes a lot of psychology and trauma work and emotional work, grief work, and integrates that through the inner-outer dynamic and how the outer world affects us, and then how we can actually process those emotions, and not only to feel better, but to actually leverage those emotions. And this is not something that's commonly spoken of, but actually use these difficulties as boons, right? Use them as leverage into becoming more and more engaged with the world, right? And I see no other way. It's like there's this tendency to silo ourselves and to, just try to shut the world out and keep our own little island of sanity, right?
Yeah.
But and that's both good and bad. Like it's good to have an island of sanity as long as you're still connected to the rest of the ocean and the rest of land masses, right? To extend the metaphor. So again, that's the inner outer, that's the personal and the collective, the heal yourself to heal the planet. So I'll just sort of stop there.
Great, thank you. Thank you. And I think to be fair, for the people who are brand new to this podcast, to this Islands of Sanity course over the coming months, I'd like to just put this in context. Like, where does Climate Cure, your book, fit into this year-long program? And I just want to say that each month, starting in September of 2024, each month we'll have 2 live Zoom days or sessions. It's actually just 2 hours of the first and third Saturdays of each month between September of 2024 and 2025. And the first hour of the 2 hours of this coursework on each of those days is going to be what we would usually call book club. And it's still going to be book club, but it's going to be so well held by the larger container of this Islands of Sanity coursework. And what's particularly alive for me out of what you were just saying at really the kind of higher end of how embodied your work tends to be. You were just talking about the levels at which we could conceivably be doing some trauma healing, some integration of understanding of the dynamics, the repetitive dynamics of unmetabolized or unhealed trauma in our lives. These are really advanced distinctions. And of course, we're going to be starting on the more incremental and more basic end of that, but still embodied practices nonetheless. And I'd like to just mention that you divide your book into it looks like 5 sections, and I'm particularly interested in this section 2. And I just want to mention some words that you use as you're describing that section, so people can get a sense of, oh, that's going to be coming soon after we get going with this book club part of Islands of Sanity. And section 2 explores dynamic emotional intelligence skills for working with and reaping the unique gifts contained within grief, anger, fear, and concludes with a comprehensive chapter for managing eco-anxiety. These chapters set the groundwork for deep inner healing, skillfully engaging with climate breakdown and building enduring resiliency. So, I don't mean to be too repetitive with this acknowledgement, but just the hand in glove fit of your way of laying out the work and the kind of trajectory of the work, and how it gets a bit more in depth at each step of the way. It's just perfect as an introduction, and perfect as a way that those who want to do deeper dives are going to be well prepared for those deep dives.
Yeah.
As they go through these layers. So I'm noticing, I'm just going to kind of break the pattern for a moment with us and ask us both to just become present to, we've got this first of what I hope will be a series of interviews and possible panel discussions where you'll take part, and possibly even times when you'll come and join us in the book club in a session or two is over time. That would be just wonderful. And I'd like us both to just look at what we're present to here in the last week of July. We're about a month out from the beginning of this course, and we're setting the path out for those who want to come and take part to participate in this program. And I particularly would like to just mention that this is a different world than I was present to even a year ago. For sure, it is massively different than 2 years ago. And indistinguishable, I mean, excuse me, inarguably radically different, from 10 years ago. So we are in the midst of a radically changing, morphing, intensifying, accelerating situation. And you've mentioned some elements that seem critical to weave into a sincere practitioner's path, to be able to expand our capacity to be present as things intensify, as things accelerate, as possible activation of residual trauma in my own system. And it might be new to me if I'm a new person to this path, and these are big waves of stressors coming in. I want to be, as much as possible, expanding my capacity to be present in the face of these incoming waves. And the last thing I'll say in terms of what I'm asking us to explore for a moment together is, if I have the privilege of being able to sit in circle with other people, where it's not antagonistic, it's not argumentative, it's in fact holding space for one another to walk our individual paths in parallel, to hold space for one another, to be in the process of becoming and expanding our capacities together. This seems like a remarkable opportunity for all of us, myself included, holding perhaps the center point of the holding space for the coursework. But I am just as much a participant in terms of continuing to expand my capacity so that I may hope to be of service to those I love in the face of these larger and larger waves of stressor. Does that spark you to say anything in the context of your
Yeah,
book, your work?
it does. I think that thank you for all that. The one thing that really stood out is how to be present with what's going on.
Mm,
And I think that in itself is very important, right? To be able to be present, not just to bear witness, but the capacity to be present is a almost a definition of being okay, right? And
mm,
so how do we be okay? How do we be present? How do we feel connected to life and live and give and exchange love in the midst of so much difficulty? And so I think it comes back to, I mean, the book is full of emotional intelligence, right? It's about
mhm,
how to deal with all these different emotions, right? Fear, anger, grief, helplessness, depression, anxiety, and deep dives into all those subjects, all those emotions. And um, so I think it comes back to how do we stay present, right? And if you pay attention, right? If you're paying attention to the world, if you're engaged with other people, if you're having relationships, well, it's going to cause pain, right? So you have to have tools for how to deal with your pain. And if you don't have tools to deal with your pain, and no judgment in this, you're going to separate from the world, and
mm,
that's a pain all in itself, right? But it's a little bit less acute. It's more of a numbed pain, a removed pain. And but so how do we stay engaged with one another in the world when it causes us so much pain? And that's really what the book is about. It's about how to metabolize the stuff, how to work with the stuff, how to reframe it cognitively, how to deal with it in the body, and then, like I mentioned before, how to leverage all these difficulties. And there's a really important concept that I mentioned in the book. It's a term that I coined. It's called fear mark, and it's in the fear chapter.
mhm,
And fear is really, I think, the foundational emotion when it comes to the climate and the polycrisis. And the fear mark, in a nutshell, is basically that we will pay attention to to what our fear will tolerate. So if our fear goes beyond a certain threshold in terms of intensity of feeling, it's like we stop paying attention because it's just too bloody scary. Okay, so there's tips especially for how to deal with fear and how to understand the different kinds of fear, helpful fear and unhelpful fear, and and being able to metabolize fear and the other emotions, not only personally but collectively together, right? And also with support of the natural world, what's left of our beautiful natural world.
mm.
um, and I just want to read one quick thing. This really isn't written in Climate Cure, but I have my tattered copy, and when you and I spoke before we turned on the record button here, there was one little piece of paper where I'd written a note, after the book was out and everything, and it was stuck in the book. And I just want to mention it because it's really like a summation of so much. So, and it ties into what I shared earlier and what you've discussed. This note reads, emotions we are challenged by in our personal lives, the emotions we are challenged by in our personal lives are the same emotions we are challenged by with the climate crisis. Okay? So that's the Venn diagram of overlap, right? Emotionally. Both intersect in our hearts, the overlap. Since many are more concerned with their personal lives, beginning with one's own heart is therefore a portal into the climate crisis and into climate emotions, right? And so the book is Heal Yourself to Heal a Planet, but it's also, how the planet and how the world heals us, right? So it works both ways, but because people generally are, and this is hardwired in us, we deal with our own personal lives first, right? And if someone is overwhelmed in their personal life, it's very hard for most people, not all people, most people, to dedicate energy to activism and to engaging with the world and helping with others. Some people are able and are just sort of motivated for whatever reason to operate from their own pain, and their own pain actually causes them to reach out and be there for others. And that's a bit of a mixed bag if they haven't tended to their own selves, because yes, they can extend compassion, but their own trauma often comes into play, and that trauma ends up traumatizing other people. So, dealing with ourselves is very important. And and but it's all paradoxical. Dealing with ourselves requires support from others. So these overlaps are all mentioned in the book and unpacked. And one of the, just stepping back from that micro view, to the macro, is one of the trajectories that I've spoken to is that, this personal work, personal trauma work is so crucial, but ironically, paradoxically, it's becoming less and less available as the poly crisis, as our, is as I view the crises in our world as our own darkness coming back upon us, right? Because we've created so much of this stuff. And as that mounts, right, and comes at us, there becomes less and less space, right, energetically and physically and financially and socially, to do that inner work. And so I've always said, it's like, do the inner work as bloody fast as you can, and again, paradoxically, that process can't be rushed. So do your personal work, because time is running out, in a sense, right? To be able to do that in a quality way. So anyway, and that gives you this foundation to interact with the rest of what's going on and the rest of what's coming down. It's all foundational stuff, and I think so much of it is emotional primarily, right? I mean, the neuroscientist Antonio Damasio, like one of his big discoveries is how emotions determine so much of our decision making and how we experience the world. And I think if you reflect on your own life, you can see that that's true. Then the other aspect is critical thinking, but I think critical thinking is secondary, because again, with the fear mark, we pay attention to, and we realize truths that our fear can tolerate.
Mhm.
So if we're overwhelmed and stacked up with trauma and stuff, it's like we're just not going to be able to pay attention to very much, most people.
Yeah. Yeah, really good. Yeah, Jack, I'd like to follow a thread you brought up earlier. That's a slight it's a slight shift, but it is a monumental shift. Elements that you didn't have to include in your book, and it certainly has happened long after I finished my book long ago.
Mm-hmm.
And these are elements of, so what do we do on the level of global society, global culture, global marketplaces? How do we shift how we are in terms of the human systems that we're renowned for, that are really the foundation pieces of how we see ourselves? We are consumers. We are, financial and economic massive systems that are all powerful. in this world, and obviously instrumental and core to everything we're talking about in terms of climate and a number of other collapse of systems that we're talking about. So one thing that you were mentioning was, what about degrowth? What about simplification? What about slowing down at any level? Is there a possibility that we could start to inch that in that direction? And could that be significant? And I'd also like to mention, on the other end of the spectrum, there's the introduction recently of artificial intelligence, which obviously they've been working on it for years, but really it's in this past year that it has just exploded into reality. What I'm noticing is that with the inclusion of artificial intelligence, it is already accelerating and intensifying the zero-sum, ultimately competitive nature and perverse incentives of our human operating system. So we, on the one hand, we have this really lovely notion of, would it be possible for us to slow down? Would it be possible for us to redesign a way to have degrowth be somehow installed or included in any portion of our global systems? And I consider that kind of an idealized possibility. I'd be happy to talk about that with you and just see what seems to be present after a few years of it gestating. And then I'd also like to just mention what in the past few months has been gestating in terms of this intensification of the zero-sum game that is our global system with AI. So would you like to take either of those first and take a look for a moment?
Yeah. Well, at first, I just want to say I'm really just so appreciative of what you've shared here and the depth of your inquiry, and then the questions that you distill from that to me. I'm just like, each one just sort of like stuns me in a way, and I love that. So thank you. It's how we've always interacted. Um, and what comes up for me when you share is, I think it's there's a lot of paradox, right, that we need to hold, and it's another theme or motif that I cover in Climate Cure, and that's holding a tension of opposites, right? And the late Jungian therapist Marion Woodman, spoke a lot to being able to hold tension of opposites and how important that is. And a tension of opposites, right, is yin and yang, being able to hold yin and yang, and being able to hold cognitive dissonance when things, don't make sense. And instead of just polarizing to something comfortable, you wait, right? And you wait for a distillation, you wait for the unconscious to bring it into a kind of, unified paradoxical whole. And so to speak to what you shared, I think that slowing down is really important. And at the same time, this is going to be different for everybody, right? So it's like everything is potentially different for everybody. And when I share these perspectives, it's just how I view it, a lot of where I've come to, what I think is maybe a more skillful or more meaningful way to go about things, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's true for people. And so I think everybody has their own tolerance. Everybody's got their own trauma load, their own, financial situation and family situation, health situation. So all of this is so unique for each of us. And so I throw out these seeds, right, for whatever they cause to germinate as truth, for people personally. And so holding this tension of opposites, slowing down is like a great thing. And I love slowing down, but I also like speeding up, right? And I like being really productive. I am a tremendously motivated and passionate person. And so I have more writing than I have time to do. I have more activism than I have time to do. And at the same time, if I get too caught up in all of that production and doing, I sort of lose a sense of soulfulness and a sense of being in the present. So I find my own balance between slowing down, and one of the most beautiful ways that I find to slow down is I live in nature, and I live on the edge of wilderness, and I live very primitively. Having this internet connection is like the most high tech thing that I have going on in my life here. And so, the slogan of my website is um, outwardly simple, inwardly rich. Right? And so it's whatever a person values in their life, right? And there are times we need to slow down in life and times that we need to speed up in life. And with regards to AI, yes, it's like a new meta level of technology and integration, and poses all kinds of different dynamics, which is a very long discussion. But it's also how we use things, right? It's like social media is like a great tool, right? But it can also become addictive and, create, mental, emotional health issues. Well, AI, is similar in a way, and in ways it's being imposed upon us. And, in other ways it's super helpful. Like I go and I Google something, and, it's like Google gives me the AI summation. And it's like brilliant. Like I love that, so there are things that can be used to our benefit, and we just have to be discerning, right? And that necessitates critical thinking and having discussions and learning. So it's just another dynamic, I think, with positives and negatives that we need to just work with, because it's here.
I love how you started us out with your response and talking about the dynamic tension of opposites, or the different and high contrast elements, tried to hold them in the same hand. And that's just another level of reassurance for me of how potent your particular lineage, your track, your way of communicating about this neighborhood, if you will, is such a perfect fit for where I believe we all are, all of us who are sincerely exploring this new territory of the newly intensified and accelerated elements that seem full on aimed at collapse or at a self-terminating conclusion. And I'm not at all trying to say, well, this is certainly going to happen, absolutely, or make some prediction of dates and so on. It's not at all my point in saying words like the ones I'm using right now. But it does seem to me that we are, especially with the addition of AI, of artificial intelligence, as I mentioned, it seemed like the accelerator is now being slammed to the floor, and we are just going at a pace and a level of intensity that I never could have imagined. And yet there's something, I've pretty long ago stopped using the word hope. I think there's so many inappropriate ways that is used that it's almost useless now, and kind of derogatory to the conversation. But if I had something like hope in my system to express, I would want to express it in what you were saying about expanding my capacity to hold opposing elements, opposites. How can I possibly hold these disparate elements that are crazy making? They're so different. They seem so antagonistic. And that is a lovely aspiration, to sit in circle with others and for us to expand our capacities together to be able to hold that level of contrast, that level of opposition. that's something really worth getting out of bed in the morning for. Is that making sense at all?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
Um, did you want to add anything to that?
I'm just noticing that we've covered a lot of ground. I love this as a first level of our conversations, which again, I just hope we will have layer upon layer as the weeks and months go by. I feel like folks who are new to this offering from Living Resilience, this Islands of Sanity in a Mad World, uh, and of course the book club people who may or may not join us in the whole course experience. I feel like people have gotten a sense of how your book, Climate Cure, fits into this first 3 months of a year-long program, how it is such an extraordinary fit with the different levels and different threads of this conversation that will really be coming on fast. I think you introduced them beautifully in your book, and certainly in the coursework for Islands of Sanity, we will also be looking at those threads
Yeah.
from day one.
Mhm.
So I think we've covered a lot of the basics, and certainly we've got a chance to meet you, and that's great. And I didn't know we would get to this last piece of the conversation today. It's kind of previews of coming attractions because, somewhere around the third month or so, we're going to be introducing some elements that are really not messing around. They're really, the stakes are growing quite high in every dimension of this conversation of who will we be together
Mhm.
as we lean into this extraordinarily existentially threatening future. And so, we got a little teaser out about
Mhm.
some of those um, really challenging elements, challenge on top of challenge of those elements coming now faster than ever. I'm
Dean,
curious. Sorry.
good. Yeah, good. I just wanted to tack on a little bit to our conversation of what you said. I feel like it'll really tie some things together.
Please, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but do you want to? I want you to remember your thought. You said you're curious about.
Hmm.
Do you
No,
want to
you
mention
go
that?
ahead.
So,
You go
okay.
ahead then, and I'll wrap us up at the end.
Okay, so I just want to mention, again, this sort of like meta perspective of what I call the triangle of resilience relationships, which is the same kind of relationships that you've come up with in your own contemplation and inquiry of this.
Mhm.
And that is an island of sanity, right? So it's a multidimensional relationship network that creates an island of sanity. And I think that's another, just like I spoke to the universality of the metaphors, right? Of being able to view each new situation through these foundational metaphors. Well, the same island, the same multidimensional triangular pyramidal um, uh, relationships for resilience are going to be the same, right? Because that's how we're wired as human beings, and that's relationship with ourselves, right? That's the personal work, our relationship with ourselves, and then relationship with one another, with community, with other humans, and then relationship with the more than human natural world. And in terms of like the degrowth and the paradox I was talking about before, I think it's what each person is called to, right? And so another kind of term that I mentioned is like becoming medicine for our times. And I feel like we each have our own medicine to bring to these times, right?
Mhm.
And and that's a calling and that's a passion. That's also a source of meaning. So that's going to be different for every person, but it's it comes from being able to be supported in these primary networks,
Mhm.
right? Those the triangle of resilience relationships. So that's what I just wanted to mention in terms of the Islands of Sanity, and some of the things that we had talked about before.
Yeah. Beautiful. Beautiful. I at the risk of repeating a couple of things you've just said, I've been drawn since the beginning of my deep diving into this material and in preparation for writing my book back in 2015. I've been fond of that often misquoted. I don't even remember the exact quote from Albert Einstein, but the idea that the problems that we're now encountering cannot be solved at the level at which they were created, and with the level of thinking at which with which they were created. And I'd like to just expand that out, because it seems like, if I could put words in his mouth, it's not just about changing our thinking. It's a new level of relating. It's a new level of being, of presencing. It's a new level of how we deploy our attention, what we are attending to in our lives. These changes in thinking, in being, in relating, and so on, these are not intuitive. These are not something that we just stumble into because we've read the quote a couple of times or 100 times.
Mm-hmm.
These take work. And this is what I believe you're calling, and I use the same words and call it the inner work of collapse. And to truly generate a new way of relating, to truly generate a new way of thinking, you talk about metabolizing in our feeling body. These are remarkable skill set shifts that, well, I'm just really glad. I feel more blessed than ever that I have these circles in which I can be as engaged as anyone in the expansion of capacity to be present in the face of these larger and larger stressors, and to be building out these skill sets, to be discovering and curating and supporting one another in building out these skill sets of new ways of thinking, new ways of communicating, new ways of relating.
Yeah.
And again, I guess I'm also just one last thing to be thankful for is that you've spent the time to put together this really beautiful book, and I'm so excited to be able to finally install it in a substantial way into this new offering here. And I just really look forward to our having a few more conversations over the course of this year. It couldn't be better for me.
Yeah, I love it. Just to respond quickly to what you said, that Einstein quote, right?
Yeah.
It's like a situation cannot be solved at the level of the situation, something like that. And I've always sort of like agreed with that and disagreed with it. And I think that's another tension of opposites. It's another into paradoxical thing. And when you live an embodied life, right? I mean, if we just use the example of trauma, right? When you do trauma healing, it's like, and you do it from an embodied somatic place, it's like you are at the level of the problem. It's like you have to be at the level of the problem as part of solving or healing that problem, right? So, and but at the same time, and this is the more cognitive aspect, and that's the meta perspective. It's like when you do trauma work, you realize that as you work through old pain in the body, you realize that you're not that child, or you are not that person that experienced it, right? And so that's the Einstein part of being out of it. So I think it's both. And so Einstein's comment, in whatever context it was originally mentioned, I think it needs a little bit more integration and perspective in that sense. And so that is an embodied life, right? Of being present with what's happening, right? And not shutting ourselves completely down so that we're affected by everything. So how do we take all the shit that we feel and turn it into, you know, compost, right? How do we grow something from it? And that requires being embodied at the level and also being above and having that perspective in a sense, right?
Beautiful.
So
Beautiful. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
sorry, I get into these. I could talk to you all day about this stuff. So if you're gonna say something, I'm probably gonna want to share more about it, but I will
Okay.
refrain because I know we're at time. So
That's wonderful. Well, Jack, let me just change this. And it has just been a pleasure. Such a pleasure to open up this hopefully long series of get-togethers, of interviews, of podcast episodes, and possibly panel discussions during this year. Thank you so much for your work, Jack, and just for being such a great friend. And I really look forward to our time together and creating together a bit.
right on. Okay, may it continue.